This is Proton Torpedo, the quest to bring every Steam game to Linux. My name is Ethan, and we're going to have a fun time today. So just as a preliminary thing, if you want the slides, I made a tiny URL. It's just MAGFest Proton. I'm on social media, Twitter, and, well, why do I rip Google+? But, I mean, if you want to see stuff that I wrote over there, that's the name. And, of course, if you are interested in any of the stuff I do and want to pay me to do it, then feel free to do so. Just as a quick background for those who don't know, I've been doing Linux and Mac games as an independent contractor for 6.5 years now. I've basically shipped around 50. I don't know if that's actually the right number. It might be 56 now. But basically, the last 6.5 years, I've shipped about 50, hoping to get to 60 by the end of this year. Lots and lots of packages because we have Steam, GOG, Itch, Humble Bundle, and probably packages I've forgotten about. I have to look at my list. That's actually wrong. There's actually a third IGF Grand Prize winner now. I forgot to update this slide for Quadrilateral Cowboy. What people know me for outside of the Linux world is I work on an XNA reimplementation called FNA. Basically, I just take like the whole XNA spec and I just re-implemented it from scratch in a clean room. So the idea is that you can take an XNA game, recompile it, and it will just work. And in fact, we actually have experiments that are active right now where we're trying to make it work without having the source code. So that will be fun if we can get it to kind of work as a mainstream program. Lots of open source libraries. You've probably recognized OpenAL, SDL, or any of that if you do any sort of multi-platform game development. And I generally do Linux and Mac stuff, but I've also done some stuff on Windows like V and Fez and PC versions of some of the Ska Studios games. But last year I started something very interesting that actually is a little different. You may recognize some of these if you squint. That's just sort of my, I think Ryan Gordon calls it a NASCAR jacket. This is my NASCAR jacket. But the funny thing is, this is actually going to be the first panel that I do here at MAGFest where I'm not going to be talking about any of these, with one exception in particular. But even then, it's not quite in the same way that you'd expect. So getting to the kind of the subject in question, I was actually working on Dust and Elysian Tale for Switch. It came out in September, and there's going to be an update, just like a patch to it this month, I hope. And so one of the things I was doing was I needed to get audio working on the console, and I was using OpenAL, and I couldn't do that. So given that Dust is an XNA game and uses Exact, and Exact is sort of like an FAudio library, so I decided I was just going to re-implement FAudio from scratch. And that way, since I had control over the entire mixer, I could just push whatever I wanted to whatever console backend I needed, and this worked out pretty well. Just like, and again, like much like FNA, if you're familiar with FNA, a lot of the focus is on accuracy, and so FAudio was no exception to that rule. And when I say like in basically every library I write, I try to make it very, very developer friendly, and in this case, I don't even link to libc if I don't need to. And it's permissive, which is great for console development. As far as I know, there's nothing like FAudio that's under a permissive license. So that was a pretty big deal, at least at the commercial scale. And one of the things that we developed as part of researching FAudio accuracy was I put up a bounty to make a wrapper that would load the FAudio API as like basically what you would do is you could make a fake FAudio 2DLL that linked to FAudio, and then if you just registered it as the FAudio 2DLL, you could just run Windows games, and it would actually load an FAudio-based FAudio like API implementation. And that actually turned out to be really, really useful. And so now that we have all this test data, we have a bunch of stuff integrating it, like OpenFL is starting to use it, so if you're like a Flash type developer that's kind of moving your way over there, you're going to see my name a couple times. There's a couple of games that I can't quite talk about that are using it. And then a couple months before I was getting Dust out in cert, I got an email from somebody. But before I talk about who that person was, I need to get this out of the way. This is an independent panel. There are many names I'm going to be dropping throughout this panel, and don't affiliate me with any of them strictly, so if I say something stupid, get mad at me, not them. But anyway, I got an email from someone named Andrew Acom. He's a developer at Codeweavers, and he got in touch with me asking about asking about getting FAudio as an XAudio 2 implementation in Wine, because they actually all I knew at that point was that he needed XAudio 2. Ours seemed to be more accurate, and they had a specific need for accuracy for some particular reason at that time. And I didn't really know what that meant. I know they do ports every now and then, so I figured, okay, so maybe they've got a couple games, and I know Unreal 4 uses XAudio, so maybe they're just trying to do something like that. As it turns out, I was right, but I was off by about 22,000 games instead of just one or two. And so here we are with this thing that they announced called Steam Play. You probably know it as Proton because that's just the name that everybody went with, because Steam Play Steam Play is a very broad term that references like the fact that you can buy a game on Windows and it works on Linux. Just in terms of if there's a Linux version, you don't have to pay extra for it. And so this is basically just what they wrote in the Valve announcement. The idea is, I mean, if you've heard of it, it's pretty much what you'd expect. It's just running Windows games on Linux using a compatibility layer. It's got some fancy stuff for DirectX 11 compatibility. It's got stuff to make full screen nicer, and it's got a joystick backend that's actually better than what you would get on Windows. So like if you use a PS4 controller, you don't need something like DS4 Windows to run your PS4 controller with those types of games, thanks to SDL, which is what we implemented it with. But the one that kind of shows up at the end, they reference this throughout the rest of the announcement, but I kind of just highlighted at the very end performance for games that have been greatly improved compared to vanilla Wine. And so this is where I have to talk a little bit about Wine. For those who don't know, or even those who know but don't know like kind of the gritty details of it, basically it's a compatibility layer, not necessarily like a whole VM or anything, but it just takes like the Windows API and runs the Windows executables in a way that you can kind of trick it into thinking it's running on Windows, but in reality it's mapping everything to native like Unix or Unix-like APIs. Because in this case we're talking about Linux, but it also works on Mac OS and the BSDs and the various other types of platforms like that. And even no matter how I angle that, the question always does come up, which is basically, it sounds pretty much like an emulator, even though you're trying to say it's not an emulator. Emulators are great, but technically, like even like GameCube games on PC, like they can get slow. So it's like, okay, are we facing a similar situation with that, where it's like, are we taking a performance hit? And if it's not taking a performance hit, then what about the part where it's like, well, what's the point of making native versions? Because if it's the same performance, what's the big deal? There's a lot of discussion that can go on about this, but basically, the answer is that it's complicated. If you want to dig into the details, you can. There's a lot of different angles you can go at it with, like performance and accuracy and blah-de-blah-de-blah. And even if I wanted to make a particular statement on that, the fact is there are much smarter people who have made statements on this, like Valve and Code Weavers. Go read what they had to say. And so the thing that I think people took up initially when they were looking at Proton was like, oh, hey, I can run games like The Witcher 3 or like Soul Calibur 6 or like any relatively recent game, like big AAA games. And to some extent, that's true. But the one that I think is a little bit more important is not necessarily this kind of category of game. I think the much more important category is this one. So we're talking the games like from a long time ago, back when Steam, it was not easy to actually get on the platform. Games that have just long since been abandoned. Like, there's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to email Ubisoft and be like, hey, do you want me to do Beyond Good and Evil 1 for Linux? Like, I'm not getting a call back for that. So we have this whole set of games, and there's a lot of games, and like you probably recognize quite a few of those from kind of the, I don't want to say the golden age, but like certainly like the time when Steam was really revving up its market share on the PC. And so this is something I refer to as the back catalog problem. Which is, not only do we have all these games that we have from many, many years ago, like referring to the present, but the fact is there are lots and lots of games coming out right now, and The back catalog is not something. In very, very rare cases, the back catalog can shrink by like one game every like 7 years because of like a licensing issue. But the fact is, the back catalog doesn't go away. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, on the PC in particular has this really big problem where it's like the PC's been around for like absolutely forever. Even just referring to like Intel x86 or like modern 32-bit x86 or whatever. And the problem is that we do not give a crap about making sure that this works long in the future. Like on consoles, it's bad, but at least with the excuse with consoles is that the new hardware comes out, so like the games, like you're not going to port everything over because there's changes. But like even on Windows, where not a whole lot has changed, we do a very, very poor job of making sure the games work. And in fact, like especially with things like DRM and online accounts, and even online accounts for single-player games for who knows what reason, it does a lot of damage to games that people. There's no reason that it couldn't run, but we just kind of throw that in the trash. And Windows, in a lot of different ways, is a lot like that. And even if you're a Windows-only user, you've probably noticed over the last couple of years that Windows 10 updates in particular have a really, really stupid habit of just breaking the dumbest possible things. Like I can name like when the Xbox controller firmware update came out, it broke like Dark Souls because it did both X input and direct input drivers. I don't even know how it happened. And then there's like the time when like it deleted people's user folders, and I think that's because of a file API that had been around since the early 90s. They decided, yeah, we're just going to break it. And I'm pretty sure that is one of the reasons that happened. There's lots of really, really stupid things that they're doing to break compatibility with their own operating system, and that is a problem. And so I would consider Wine not just as a way of getting Windows games running on other platforms. I would consider it more of a preservation project than anything. Usually when you hear about preservation, especially I know there was a whole preservation path at MAGFest this year where they're probably talking about like retro games or like old computers, like old software and cartridges and things that kind of vanish. And so we have like emulators that do that, and then we have like virtual machines which kind of don't necessarily fill that kind of role, but in theory could, many, many years from now. And then there's like re-implementations of things like FNA, which is I've always called FNA a preservation project first because it's meant to preserve XNA, and I was kind of hoping it would help with Xbox Live Indie Games preservation, but it turns out getting that data is way too hard for some reason. And then there's like Open Morrowind, which you might have tried if you're a big Morrowind fan. And I kind of put Wine in that category. So in reality, for me, Proton isn't really so much as a nice way to kind of get games to run on Linux even if the developer doesn't want to. It's more of a back catalog problem where we're not just thinking about the developers that are making games right now. We're thinking about developers who've made games since for the last 20 years, basically. And certainly for the next 20 years, depending on, hopefully we will not be on x86 in 20 years. I don't know. But the way we do it is that basically there's a bunch of little things that Proton consists of, but at its core, it's basically Wine with a little bit of spice, which is actually, if you go to the GitHub repository for Valve's Wine branch, it actually says that. And so we have a lot of little tweaks in it, like we have DXVK, which instead of doing Dark3D11 to OpenGL, there's actually a separate project that does Dark3D11 to Vulkan. And then there's also another library that does Dark3D12 to Vulkan, and we have tiny little things like Wine Staging is like a place where they have like experimental patches, but they haven't put it into like the main branch yet, but it's still technically useful, so we just shove that into the Proton branch. And the end result, I know this is all a bunch of random technical jargon, but the answer that you're looking for is, yes, it actually does work pretty darn good. It's actually reasonably good. There are specific reasons that it does not, and we kind of have to talk about that next because there is a very strict set of rules involved in Proton, and basically the idea is that we're not necessarily releasing this for every game. The way we're doing it right now is that we have basically a small set of games that are on a whitelist based on specific versions that we have right now. So like the first version that was shipped in August was 3.7, and there's a specific set of whitelisted games that we know for a fact work on 3.7, so we just lock it down to that. And then as we do more and more versions, like 3.16 is what's out right now, we have more and more games that we're whitelisting for that. And so the idea is that we can kind of incrementally go out, and if we do our job correctly and make it accurately, even though the whitelist feels restrictive now, the idea is that if we can get it to work well enough, the whitelisting process will be so much faster because we know that all the stuff that all these games use, all these little bits and pieces will actually work. And we don't have to worry about like adding a bunch of hacks or having to do workarounds, because one of the other things that we have to deal with is that it actually has to work exactly like a normal game. So there shouldn't be any configuration involved. You should be able to click on the game. It'll do the stupid like DirectX Redist stuff that we didn't sidestep that, sorry. And it will actually just run and you won't be able to tell. And so that introduces some problems, especially with DRM. Like we can't fuss with Denuvo. We can't, like, I know there are multiple people trying to figure out stuff like the Uplay launcher and like all the launchers that you deal with from publishers now. That's a problem. And then there's stuff like .NET, where .NET is I'll talk about that later. I'll try not to start ranting now. But and the idea is that we're trying to make it work with Wine's built-in stuff. So right now we still do like the DirectX redistributables and stuff like that. But the idea is that in a perfect world, we'll be able to have that stuff built into what ships in the default Wine installation and just not have to deal with that stuff at all. And one really good example of that is the FAudio 2 stuff, which was the reason they came to me was because their original implementation is based on OpenAL, and they get like sort of the easy stuff that they can get, but the problem is that OpenAL is a high-level audio API, and FAudio 2 is significantly lower level, so a lot of stuff didn't map, and the result is that a bunch of games did not work. Normally, like usually, like when you do like a broad implementation of an API, for the most part that's meant to work, but then you get to like some of the really, really high-end stuff, and they do some really weird, goofy stuff, and so like sound levels weren't being respected, like positions weren't happening, like stuff would just cut out because streaming was kind of weird. And so that was a really, really good example of like, you can't say good enough, it has to actually be like good, period. Because when you're talking about 22,000 games, most is not a very good number. That's a lot of, not most. I don't know how else to put that. And then even worse is that on 64-bit Windows, for some strange reason, FAudio 2 has a hack in it that I'd have to ask. I forgot to ask Andrew about the details, but basically, it just like truncates pointers and does some really strange things that I guess they might have hacks inside Windows itself. But basically, 64-bit FAudio 2 does not work, and so you would just get a bunch of crashes and things would like cut out and like horrible static noises. And so thankfully, FAudio was a really good workaround for that at the time, because the COM wrapper I developed for Windows experimentation happened to work as a Wine thing as well. And so the idea was like, hey, why don't we just make this the implementation? And as of a few weeks ago, we actually, if you download the latest Proton beta, it actually uses FAudio for FAudio 2, so 64-bit games work a whole lot better. Effects are actually processed, and all the little weird low-level stuff works, like positioning works. And so the idea is that now that we have that working, we kind of went just like quick and dirty, get it out there. Now we're going to kind of stabilize it, make it nice and clean, and then we're going to try and get it into Wine upstream. And this is good for many, many reasons, not just because it means that Proton works in the sense of like Valve's product works, but the nice thing is that it helps a whole bunch of people out at once, in that all the people who are using Wine outside of Steam can use it, which is like maybe some GOG games like that are Windows only. You can use Wine using the stuff that we developed for Steam. And it also means that the FAudio project itself got a whole lot of really good work done on it. So the FAudio work, it's going back into FNA because all that stuff is shared, and then OpenFL is going to get that benefit, and then all our console ports are going to get a benefit out of it. Basically, the idea is that even though we have this centralized project that we're trying to work on, we're doing everything we can to make it so that the ecosystem gets what it needs. We're not walling the stuff off. It needs to be free and open source, and users need to have the exact same freedoms we did when we made this. And that's just that's a hard rule for me, and I imagine most of my colleagues on this project would agree. But if you're looking for a more broad sense of where it's at, for the most part, what happens is that we get a submission, and then there's like an API call that's missing, or like there's a particular feature that just wasn't available, or like there's a little tiny like content format that just was never seen until then. And so that's usually most of it, and it's pretty quick to fix, and we can kind of get those all like bundled up into updates. I wrote for the bad as performance problems second to accuracy. That's kind of only half true, because there are sort of two schools of thought whenever you're working on a project like this, which is performance more important or is accuracy more important? And both sides have pretty good arguments. Obviously, Valve cares very much about performance because they want people to be able to run the game and have it feel exactly the same. But you have to be able to do that well, because if you don't, then the alternative is that, okay, it's fast, but then it crashes after 2 minutes. So what's the point? So we have to make sure that like changes like esync and DXVK, like we have to make sure that that actually works, and we can still get the performance benefit out of it without making everything all broken and terrible. And so like that's all like manageable. There's some stuff that we're working on that is just ridiculous. Like .NET is just, if you're like a C# person, I hate to break it to you, but .NET is like an absolute mess, no matter what platform you're on. Like if you just a really fun exercise is to take a wine install and just install .NET without any workarounds. Just try to do it by default and just like read the console output. It is so stupid. And like, there's all kinds of just weird stuff that like nobody understands. I'm pretty sure Microsoft themselves don't understand anymore. That's probably why they made .NET Core, if you want my personal opinion. And there's just like, but the problem is there's stuff in .NET that we kind of need, like C++ CLI. Like we kind of have stuff like that in Wine Mono, but it's just this horrible, awful mess. And it's a very complicated subject, and if you are familiar with .NET and think you could tackle a problem like this, please get in touch, because we really need some help on that. But and of course there's things like DRM, which like we're just completely screwed, and that's kind of usually the intent. Sometimes there's like anti-cheat systems as well. Like unfortunately there's some like fighting games that have some really, really tough anti-cheat that we don't really know how to get around yet. And so now, just to kind of give you a real sense of what this stuff is like, I have a demo for us. So I'm going to go ahead. I tried to find a game that kind of had a little bit of everything in it to kind of demonstrate sort of like the back catalog and DXVK and FAudio and all kinds of other stuff. So I decided, what better a game than a game like Shenmue, so this is Shenmue. This is the Windows version. As you saw, this is Steam for Linux, by the way. This is not like a Windows setup. This is all Linux. I just clicked on the game. It's booting. It's running. And so we have, and it runs. And I actually have sound over here. This might actually is either going to be an amazing demo or a horrible failure. Let's find out. So right now, like this is running through FAudio, so like it's running XAudio 2 calls, and we're returning stuff that it expects. So if I, yeah, no, this device is a little strange, isn't it? So, well, the idea is that you can basically, like, we even have multi-device support, provided the OS gives you the devices, which this currently does not. And so they're just like little accuracy things like that. Like we can't just have a generic default device and just expect it to work. There are actual real-world scenarios where people need multiple devices. So even though that seems like an annoying thing, the accuracy came first. And so in cases like this, normally it pays off. And of course, we have like graphic settings. You can see there probably in very, very small text, like it's got wine display. So there are some cases where like we have to kind of point out wine. We can't like pretend to know like exactly how Windows kind of enumerates its displays. But everything else, it's like all the standard features that are there. Like there's nothing I'm having to like turn off specifically for Shenmue. And if we go ahead and load it, and I'm gonna turn the volume way up. So if you can hear it, great. But so it turns out this was actually kind of hard too, because if you ran with XAudio 2 64-bit, like the DirectX Redis version, it would cause a bunch of crackles and like it would crash randomly. It was very inconsistent, but with FAudio, sounds perfectly fine, resampling's fine. Like if they do any sort of panning and stuff, it all works perfectly fine. And if Rio would just walk a little bit faster. So that's actually a unique little thing in that if you actually run this with Proton as it ships on Steam, you will not hear those voices, and there's a very specific reason. This is something that we actually also have to struggle with, and most of it's technical, but this is actually a really good example of a legal hurdle, which is that the voices and some of the music uses WMA for audio. Yeah, that still exists. And unfortunately, there are still patents involving it. Even though Microsoft opened up all their stuff, software patents are just a pain in the ass, so we don't know what we can do. We don't know if we can find a way to license it. And so, unfortunately, we have to turn it off. But thankfully, since FAudio is a separate module, what you can do is you could just build FAudio with FFmpeg, which is how we're doing this, and you can kind of just drop the DLL or the .so file into the Proton install, and it'll get voices and music. So there are sometimes stuff like that shows up where it'll work, but we're not sure if we're legally allowed to ship it. And so unfortunately there are gaps like that. And another thing that we have to sort of skip around, for example, is this game actually has a launcher written in .NET. It's like .NET Forms and Media Foundation and some other stuff. And unfortunately, .NET stuff doesn't work. So in this case, I just kind of made a little tiny exe that just goes straight to Shenmue 1. So unfortunately, this is not whitelistable because A, we have the patent licensing issue, and also we also have the .NET problem. So this is a good example of something that's really, really close, and you could play this from start to finish, but because of those particular little details, we have to be really strict about it, so we do not ship this as a whitelisted title. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out. And hey, it closed correctly. So if you're wondering if there's a way that you can get involved in this, do not worry. There are plenty of ways you can get involved in this. And even if you don't think you're super technically proficient, there's so much data we need to do this. So there's the Steam Play announcement, which you could probably Google that. If you Google Valve Proton GitHub or GitHub Proton, or just go to that URL, you'll find the repo where we're all working from. The main thing that we really, really need is logs for days. I don't care if the title works, we need a log of everything because we don't know what's in there. And for all we know, there's data in a functioning game that actually applies to another. And if we need to make sure that we don't get regressions, and there's all kinds of reasons that we need logs. So whenever you launch a Proton game, you can set as a launch option that line here up there, Proton log equals 1, command you can read. But basically, we just need more logs than there are molecules in the universe. It's ridiculous how much we need. And if you are someone who's into sort of development, and would like to work on this, there are lots of different kinds of developers we need, including modders, by the way. Especially if you have a really big modding community and you have modding tools, or have a modding system that you use on Windows, we really could use your help because we want to make sure that stuff works well. And if there's something that's broken with the game and you happen to know the data really well, we also need your help in understanding how that data works. So if you have really, really good knowledge of how a game works and it doesn't on Proton, we need that information. And if you're a game developer that has something that's running on Proton, we could use your help as well. Because if something breaks and the crashes are just absolutely meaningless for whatever reason, we could use their insight as to what might have happened. In one case, we had a game that for some reason ran on Windows Vista 8 and 10 and not 7 because they would initialize certain parts of Windows without calling this function called co-initialize, but something else specifically on certain machines would call it anyway. And so for the most part, their market, their customers on Windows were, it ran. So, but for Wine it didn't, and we didn't really know why, and I'm not even entirely sure we do now. And so, yeah, even if you're on the other side, not necessarily working on Linux or Proton, if you're working on Windows games, we could use your help as well. If you're familiar with 3D graphics, especially DX11 or DX12 or Vulkan, we could use your help as well, just because there's a lot of data out there, and just having another set of eyes on certain things, or if you are interested in getting a DX11 game running on Vulkan, then that would be a good thing to try. If you're, again, if you're familiar with .NET or WPF, I know the source code of WPF and like WinForms just came out, but like we still like this is probably going to be like a really long-term project, and we need as much expertise as we possibly can, because it is ugly. So how are we doing on time? Oh, we have lots of time. Okay, so again, the slides are on MAGFest Proton, or the tiny URL up there. Oh, I updated this slide, but not the other one. I'm on Twitter. It's not always technical. Sometimes I post dumb stuff, but you can always ask me questions. And of course, if you're interested in paying me to do Linux native stuff, or if you are interested in making games work a little better with Proton, or any reason you have for giving me money to work on code, I'm happy to hear your pitch. So if there are any questions or comments or concerns, certainly I would love to hear them, because we have a lot of time. So I barreled through that. Yeah. That's a really good question. No, it does not send any stuff. Basically, all it does is it dumps a Steam. It dumps a .log file in your home folder. It'll be Steam dash, and the number will be like the Steam app ID, like what you see like on the store URL. And then the Proton GitHub is where all of our stuff's currently being tracked. I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon. Okay, that was cool. But yeah, so. Oh, okay, neat. That was cool. But yeah, we don't send any of the data ourselves. So we just basically we have on the Proton issue tracker, it gives you a whole template. It like lists all the files that we would like to have, and so you can just upload them, post them, and then we can do what we need. Odds are, like the good way to check for a game if it already exists in our tracker is to just take like the app ID on the store page URL at the end, and then just type it in the issue searcher, and odds are it'll show up. I think our current issue tracker is at like 2,000 games, I think. So we're still, as far as the data, there's a statistical good chance that it's not there, unless it's like Skyrim or something, in which case that thread's been going on since day one, I know for a fact. So yeah, you just have to upload it manually, because we don't like spying at home. Yeah. Oh yeah, let's not talk about that. Even Windows users don't want to talk about that anymore. Um, but basically every launcher sucks. There's no special treatment there. It's just because it's like either it's .NET or it's like or God forbid it's Chromium, which a lot of them are. And of course you have to there's also like whatever networking stuff they do. Like we have to deal with just recently we had to deal with like SSL TLS because like GNU TLS. There's different versions, and there was like a fix that involved upgrading it, but it's not into the Steam runtime yet. And so, yeah, basically like anything that involves like phoning home is so annoying. But yeah, no one's. The thing is, you can't do a launcher well, so of course all of them suck. So, anything else? Sure. No, basically we haven't heard any feedback from. Occasionally, a developer will come in. There was I don't remember what the name of the game was, but like they had an invalid FAudio 2 API call, and FAudio actually crashed on that because there were some places where I did some really bad error checkings, but like I fixed that, but I think I just like offhand just joked like someone should probably tell them that they have an invalid API call in their game, and the developer actually replied and said, okay, we'll go fix it in the next updates. But sometimes that happens, like developer, because like usually it's just like a programmer will just it'll just catch their eye and they'll kind of check it out, and for the most part, we don't really hear any feedback from them. Unless it's something like, I know Soul Calibur 6 was one outstanding case where the Steamworks API, like the struct packing was broken, which was a problem because like when you're like uploading data, especially, Like it would just like create horribly corrupted data, and so like if you loaded Soul Calibur 6 on Linux, it basically soft locked the game even on Windows. So that was a fun fix. The developer was actually they were very kind about that, to my understanding. I wasn't involved in that, but my understanding was like it was very I don't know the term for it, but basically it just went as you would expect for a typical bug fix. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Containers, I don't know. I get that question. Funny thing is I get that question more for just my native games than Wine. Um, like I mean I make one stupid joke about Linux and I hear all about hey, what about Flatpak or Snapper? Oh God, what's the list now? There's probably in the time that we ran a panel, there's probably another sandbox. Like, I don't know what interest there is. I mean, the Steam runtime kind of, it's mostly meant for compatibility, but the way that it works, it kind of, and it almost sandboxes it for better or for worse. And of course, like Wine kind of operates in its own little world. I think everything still, with the exception of like threading primitives, I think everything still goes through the server. The async is basically pulling all that up for performance. I actually don't know. How much of an improvement it is, but it's an example of how the one case where I think we've kind of gone out of the server, for example. That's a good question to ask. Pierre Lou, like Plagman, I think he just goes by Plagman or Plagman2 on Twitter. Like he might be someone to ask about that. And maybe if you wanted to ask, like that might be like, or on Proton, you can like the GitHub, you can just tag as a question and see if someone will, because somebody will know. Yeah. Yes. Yes, by default. I probably should have pointed that out. Is that typically the way it works is that only the whitelisted games will show up as something you can install in Linux. But it's one tick box in the options on Steam. Yeah, basically it's one tick box that says let me do it on anything. You can even pick the version too, a Proton version. So you can pick 3.7, 3.16, 3.16 beta. So there's lots of options. And you can even like override the whitelist itself. So if you want to run a game that's known to work on 3.7 and make it work on 3.16, you totally can. And you can even make your own Proton, actually. That's another fun thing is you can actually build a Proton build yourself, put it in a folder called compatibility tools, and then just link to that. And so you can run your own custom version if you want to. I know the Warframe devs were, not the Warframe devs, but someone working on Warframe for Linux as a more well-packaged experience was doing that because we needed to deal with the WMA concern. So yeah, there's a lot. It's very, very flexible because we, as developers, need it to be flexible because it's a big freaking project. So anything else? Obviously, I'm here after, so if you don't want to do it on the recording or whatever, I'm here for a little while. Anybody going to GameStone quick? I'm actually going to be there all week. So nobody. You're all still hungover. I know. Yes. Lay it on me. I like Impossible. Damn it, Jim, I'm a programmer, not a miracle worker. Yeah, I think isn't Pipewire supposed to be like acting as a replacement for Pulse? Does anybody even know what Pipewire is? I think the only reason I even know about it is because I know one of the guys who's involved in like managing that. That's the only reason. Well, I think they're trying to succeed Pulse with something called Pipewire, which handles not just audio but like video as well. In some, you'd have to read about it because like I remember I read their pitch for it, and even after reading it, I still didn't fully understand it myself. I don't know. I just use SDL, and then you figure out the audio stack. I don't care. We got like 20. We have 23 backends in SDL for audio, so it's like we're used to it at this point. Yeah, so I think that will we're 15 minutes early, so if you got other things you got to do before you catch your flight or drive home, or I don't know if you're waiting for the Gaylord parking traffic to get down. I remember those days. So yeah, I think that will wrap it up. So thank you all very much for coming. I'm here afterwards.